Okay, welcome everyone to the EECS Department Colloquium. And it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jeff Welser. Jeff is the Chief Operating Officer for IBM Research and Vice President of Exploratory Science and University Collaborations. It's a mouthful, so I want to make sure I had that right. The rest of his intro I know very well. I go back a long way with Jeff. He joined IBM Research in 1995 after completing a PhD in electrical engineering at Stanford. He's spent something like 8 or 9 years at the IBM Watson Research Center working on semiconductor and silicon technologies and made some very important pioneering contributions. Then he did a little work on administering university programs for the Semiconductor Research Corporation before moving to, well, I guess he moved technically to Almaden at that time, and has been at the Almaden Research Lab of IBM since then, and now has this really fascinating, terrific overview of the entire portfolio of IBM Research. So he's going to tell us about what's going on at IBM Research, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it. Welcome, Jeff Welser.
So thanks very much, Jeff. Yeah, we go ways back. I've been in the industry now at IBM for 28 years, which is a long time. I thought I might jump companies for a while, but I found IBM to be quite fascinating in terms of the research we can do and the breadth we do. So hope to share a little bit of that with you today. We'll start off with what does IBM do? Because I think many people don't actually know what IBM does anymore. We don't make PCs. We don't do any of that anymore. We actually make nothing that goes to consumer products. The last touch point we had with the consumer products was actually the weather company, which we just sold off. So at this point, you don't actually touch IBM devices, but you actually use IBM every day. About 80% of all banking transactions still go through IBM mainframes. Anytime you use your MasterCard or Visa, you certainly are using something from IBM. If you make any plane reservations, that's all IBM. So we are B2B. We do business work. And basically what we do is supply infrastructure for the business. And we do it at all levels. So start at the bottom, hardware infrastructure, mainframes themselves, other high-end servers, but of course our own cloud, but also increasingly working with partner companies, all the gray boxes, public clouds, and enterprise infrastructure in data centers, and then also partnering with clients and other companies that do edge work. And our goal would be for an enterprise that we can manage all of their IT for them, even if they want to do it all on Amazon, for example, or Azure. We want to still be able to manage that for them as an enterprise client. Red Hat allows us to do that. We bought Red Hat about 5 or 6 years ago now. They're the big open source software company around Linux. They also offer a platform for moving between clouds and between infrastructure. So that's all part of this idea of letting enterprise really operate wherever it wants to operate. Above that, of course, software. A lot of our own software, enterprise software, a lot of partnering with major companies like SAP and other enterprise software companies. And then finally consulting, business consulting, as well as working with other consulting firms. So that's what IBM does. And then IBM Research, it's our goal, 2 goals really. One is we want to be the organic growth engine for IBM. So that is when we do organic growth, when we grow products, create new products, grow market share, we want it to come from technology that comes from research. IBM also buys companies, and we grow that way too. That's inorganic growth, that's fine, but we want to be the organic growth engine. And we also want to make sure that we maintain leadership and be sort of synonymous with building what's next in computing. And I'll be talking mostly about that today, obviously. So IBM Research is one of the few research companies that have a research division that's completely separate. My boss is the head of research, Dario Gil, and he reports directly to Arvind Krishna, who's our CEO. So we are not part of any business unit. We're not part of any development organization. We're a completely separate research organization. About 3,000 people globally. We work in lots of different areas. Obviously, electrical engineering and computer science tend to dominate, but we have a lot of other areas of researchers as well. And we do still drive research to be researchers and people who are impacting products. So people get measured on patents, product innovations, open source contributions, but also academic conferences, publishing in Science and Nature, winning awards as we've done over the years as well. So we really do try to strive to have our people be recognized in the field as thought leaders, not just for actually making our products better. Several labs around the world. Yorktown Heights is the one in the upper right. That is our headquarters, also known as the T.J. Watson Research Center. That's just north of New York City in Westchester County. Albany, where I'm based, is down in San Jose, very far part of south part of San Jose, almost down to Morgan Hill. And you can see some other major places around the world. All in all, we actually have, in addition to these, we have places in Japan, India, and actually on the continent of Africa and in Brazil as well. So most of these do a variety of research. We have some specialty centers as well. The MIT IBM Watson AI Lab is actually a very large collaboration we have with MIT right on the MIT campus. I'll talk about that on the next chart. The AI Hardware Center in Albany, there's a giant facility in Albany that's based around a 300-millimeter fab, so state-of-the-art fab, but that enables R&D down to almost anything. Some materials we won't put in there yet, but in general, we enable a full R&D facility in something that can go right into manufacturing. Quantum accelerators, we have a lot of work on quantum hardware we'll be talking about, and we've been installing those not only, obviously, at our own facilities, but in major installations like the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, University of Tokyo, the Cleveland Clinic, but places where now are starting to experiment with quantum computing for the kind of problems that quantum can solve well. And then discovery accelerators are along that same line. How do you actually apply AI, quantum, HPC to solving problems in material science or in discovery or in other forms of things that require discovering new chemicals, molecules, anything that we would normally do by just mixing things in chemistry labs? How can we use simulation and AI to actually do that more efficiently in the future? So MIT IBM Watson AI Lab is probably our largest university collaboration. That building's a brand new building in MIT campus. We have the 13th floor of that building. It's right on the edge of campus, right on the Charles there. We made this commitment about 3 years ago, large commitment with MIT. There's about 40 people who work for me there from IBM on that floor, but then they work with faculty all the way across campus, students all across campus. And really the model here is that every project that we're doing there has to have somebody from both the campus and from IBM. So it's truly a collaboration of research, not just sort of sponsored research, which we also do a lot of sponsored research with universities as well. You can see that interestingly, although we do mostly fairly exploratory AI work there, we actually have some corporate members who come and actually work with us as well. The idea there being taking some of these nascent ideas and starting to play around with real problems that a company might have to see, does it seem like it's going to be interesting if we actually are successful in this route? So it's an interesting kind of mix of far-out work and yet fairly near-term interactions at the same time. Overall, we do academic research with many partners around the globe. I'm not going to go through all of them. Actually, for some reason, the map is not showing up on that, but there is a map of the world. Those aren't just random dots up there. Anyway, lots of different universities, including Berkeley. We do a lot with the Skylab. We were one of the founding members of that, and also some work in various groups around, like individual professor kind of interactions, too. So the areas I'm going to talk about today, these are kind of the four main platforms we talk about within IBM Research: AI, quantum, semiconductors, and the hybrid multi-cloud. And these are really the areas that we focus our work on. But to kind of frame it, when we think about the future of computing, we kind of think about it in these three parts. We say bits plus neurons plus qubits. And these are all different ways of potentially doing computation. How will the future of computing bring these all together in a way that's not just sort of individual bit pieces? And how can we build the parts of that now in research to actually bring them in to what we'd say is a really hybrid cloud, not just hybrid cloud in the sense of multiple clouds, but multiple types of clouds. So starting with bits, I think this is what we normally think of when we think about computing with information. It's basically using math and digitizing things. Semiconductors is what we use for actually driving all of this. And while you may have heard that IBM is no longer a chip company, the reports of our death are greatly exaggerated. We did, in fact, actually sell off our manufacturing portion about 3 years ago. We kept all of the R&D internal. So we do all the R&D processing. We have a manufacturing partner in Samsung right now for our advanced nodes, Global Foundries for some of our further out, our previous nodes. We make the process together, and then they manufacture the chips for us as well as for themselves. And those chips go into our system. So we don't go sell chips, but we absolutely think chips are critical to our systems. Most importantly, the mainframe. So I just showed the Moore's Law plot to remind you that bits are still important. We intend to continue to increase bits. That's the original Moore's Law plot. This is the Z chip, or the Z system that came out just last year. That chip was a 14-nanometer chip with 9 billion transistors on it, so a few more than we see plotted on Moore's plot on the left, on the right. But this is a chip that was designed within research and development. A lot of the technologies that went into it were created in research in terms of keeping the process technology at the cutting edge node. Mainframes, as I said, are still used tremendously. I know everyone thinks they've disappeared. They're all over the place. This last year of our product line was the most mainframes we've ever sold in the history of IBM, because there continues to be a large market for these systems that are incredibly secure, incredibly closed, incredibly fast transaction processing. You know, millions of credit card transactions a second can go through there. The Z stands for zero downtime. We guarantee less than 3-second downtime per year. So that's a pretty short period of time that you stay up. But you know, if you're a bank, 3 seconds is still a long time if you lost just 3 million transactions. So you really can't have it go down. So that's the reason that people are willing to continue to pay and work on these sorts of systems. So research side tends to spend a lot of its time thinking about the technologies that go into that, into the manufacturing of the semiconductors. Obviously, Moore's law has continued on for quite a while in the past. Nanosheets are the current version. We showed the world's first 2-nanometer chip last year in the summer, demonstrated nanosheets of silicon to create transistors. Obviously, this is not in manufacturing yet. Manufacturing for this is still a few years off. But it is showing, we still believe there is definitely a path forward in the semiconductor bits roadmap, continuing to make high-performance chips and continuing to make that go better and better. This is the Albany Nano Center I talked about earlier. It's near Albany, New York, as you might guess. It's a very large facility. We have a lot of partners there. I already mentioned, of course, our Samsung being our biggest partner, since they do our manufacturing as well for us. But we do all levels of research there through packaging, advanced packaging, and other system innovations, largely though focused on process technology to get to the next nodes, which is why we have so many different material equipment companies up there as well as designing and tooling companies. And we are actually going to be very active in the upcoming ME Commons and NSTC programs as well. We do interact quite a bit with universities in this space, and we actually expect that to increase now with this new funding coming from the CHIPS Act. Like I said, my background is actually chips and semiconductors before I started to just be in administration. So I'm really glad to see that chips are sexy again, because for a while we got no respect, but I'm glad to see we're back on. And I think we really are trying to increase in IBM as well on this. All right, but beyond bits, we can think about neurons. And in this case, it really means how does biology deal with information? And not that we're going to build neurons, but we are thinking about that when you think about AI, right? So AI is, of course, what the biggest workloads are right now in terms of growth in workloads and becoming bigger and more expensive all the time. So how could we run these more efficiently is part of what we think about. Well, just talking about AI, I don't know how many people are in the AI versus not in AI. I think everyone knows that we are at a very different stage now. I mean, AI started off as sort of just expert systems, which are basically just rules-based systems. Where, you know, if you do this, then do this. Machine learning, which was sort of really basic statistical learning from things. Then deep learning came along with neural nets. That was great. Able to recognize cats on the internet. That was fun. But really couldn't do much in terms of actually really practical work outside of selling advertising. That turned out to be a really, really good use of AI, and there are a couple companies that made a lot of money doing that. But most of the companies, if you look at what they do with AI, it's not much. It's very, very expensive and difficult to use AI efficiently for things, unless you have a giant workload like, say, a Facebook or a Google. And then came foundation models, which in a sense are very large neural nets. We'll talk a little bit more about why they are a game changer. But we really do think this has really blown open what we think AI can do. Obviously, ChatGPT is the one that everyone knows about and gets a lot of press, good and bad. But it's just one example of what these things are. So really the difference when you get to foundation models is you go from something called supervised learning to unsupervised learning. So supervised learning is what we've always done with neural nets in the past, which was you get a bunch of data, you label that data, and you feed it into a neural net, and you get out an answer. You train that neural net, right? So you can do it for cats on the internet because there are a lot of cats on the internet. So you can actually get a bunch of labeled data that says this is a cat and this is not a cat. So that's great for that, but isn't really good if you don't have a lot of data. Or if you have a lot of data, like the medical space, you have a lot of data, it hasn't actually been labeled in a digital form that a system can go learn. So you have to have humans go and label all this. And moreover, once you do it, you have to redo it for everything else you want to do. So in unsupervised or self-supervised learning, the computer is actually doing it. You can use a ton of data, but it doesn't require labels on the data, and therefore you can do it much more quickly. And it also turns out you can do it at a scale you never could before, and that's led to these seemingly emergent properties. It definitely, I'll be really clear, I don't think ChatGPT is in any way a general AI or any kind of real intelligence, but clearly it's showing emergent properties that are very different than we would have expected before it got that large. So difference being, traditional, you have to label the data. You can do big data, but not too big because it's too expensive to label. Now you can do massive data unlabeled. And so how do you use massive data that's unlabeled? Let's suppose you have a sentence. You give it, and you say, it's raining cats. It's raining mice. It's raining cats and dogs. I think everyone who speaks English guessed it was dogs before dogs came up. So I give that example because you could feed in a bunch of text to a system, and it could take that text itself and eliminate a word like that and say, okay, if I see it's raining cats and, what's the next word? And it can guess the word, and it can check itself. Did I get it right? Right? It can do that without me labeling anything about what a cat is or what a dog is, right? So you can do that, and eventually it gets it right. So, okay, that must be, I got that trained correctly that time. And you can do it with another sentence, right? It can be a verb this time, somewhere in the middle of the sentence. So you give it words before and after now. What do you think the right word is? Again, we've got it. Our brains, our neurons have already been trained on this. We know this word. But it can do this. It can do this over and over and over again, right? And just at the scale of however many sentences you can give it, right? So ChatGPT, it's not clear how much it's read, but it's pretty much read the whole internet, as well as a lot of other things we believe, to train it. So you do this over and over until it really knows and can predict very efficiently what the next word will be. And that's really all it's doing. And that's why, the fact that we think it's intelligent is very interesting. It also says something about what we perceive as intelligence, or maybe even what human intelligence is, because it clearly is just an incredibly good pattern matcher. But the reason it's so important is by doing this huge training, first of all, you can do it because you don't have to label the data. And it then is able to even be tuned. So then you can give it a very small amount of more labeled data. Like if I want to use this now in a specific field of study, I can label some sentences to actually put in very clearly, this is what this means, this is what this means, and then tune that training a bit. And it doesn't take that much to tune it, and it becomes extremely accurate at that new task you just gave it. And that's important because you don't want to start over every time. If you had to start over for every single task, which is what we have had to do in AI, it's too expensive. You just can't do it. We had a program that used to read contracts for our lawyers. We trained it on all the data we had. It was really good at reading our contracts and identifying what you wanted. And we took it to another company that had seemingly the same business as us. It couldn't read any of their contracts because their lawyers write things just a little bit differently and the phrases are a little different, and it just couldn't quite get it right. So we essentially had to retrain it. That's not the case here. In this case, is they actually learn these things, and you can use them for lots of different applications. There's actually different ways you can use them. In fact, as you probably, if you've been following ChatGPT or played with it at all, you don't even necessarily have to retrain it. You can even just prompt it by giving it a few sentences and questions and get it on the right track as to what you're actually talking about and what the field is, and then you'll find that its results come out much better for that area you're talking about. And unfortunately, this also could be used for nefarious purposes, but in general, that's what the goal is to do. So suddenly, this allows companies to do things they could never do before. It allows them to do it in many different areas. And it's not just language, right? I mean, you can use it for tabular data the same way, knocking out pieces of tables and training it. You can use it on code. I literally saw a demonstration this morning of a new coder, large language model or foundation model we're creating. And it's amazing. You tell it what you want it to write, it writes the code. You give it code, it tells you, it writes a really nice human description of what that code does. You say there's a bug in the code, it goes try to find the bug. It's really quite good, and it's a little frightening sometimes how good it is at doing what it's doing. But that clearly is a whole new world then for our ability to actually utilize these for lots of different areas of research. But of course, along comes the same problems we've had with AI from the beginning. It really is a black box, right? We don't know how it makes its decisions, why it makes its decisions. So how do we ever use it, particularly in an enterprise sense? Because for IBM, it's one thing if you're going to use it to cheat on your essay in college, but it's another thing if you're going to use it, to make a banking transaction or do something in a business world that could actually be illegal. Is it fair is one of the first questions. Do we have any bias built into what it's doing? That's a huge problem depending on the data you're using. Can you understand why it made its decision? That's a big deal in business where oftentimes your decisions are auditable, where someone's going to come back to you later and say, why did you choose to do that? You have to be able to explain why you chose to do that. And if your explanation is, I asked ChatGPT, they probably aren't going to go fly very well with the auditors at that point. So how do you actually understand where it's coming from? Is it secure? It's very easy to train systems to do things that they shouldn't do, or to actually come up with someone hacking it and then you're using it and you don't realize it's been hacked. And accountable, the transparency again of what it's actually doing. So our point of view on this in terms of what we're trying to do, we're trying to make sure that we build a lot of this stuff very openly. Open source, of course, is really the heart of software these days, but particularly for AI, we think being incredibly open on not only what models you're using, but what data you've trained on, when you've trained it, how you filtered it, that kind of openness and building on that is going to be really important. Targeting at specific areas. So you can build a big foundation model, but you probably want to target it on the area you're trying to really focus on, because the larger that model is, the larger it's been trained on, the more chance it has of hallucinating into different odd directions, which again can be very problematic if you're actually using it in a fairly secure sense. Obviously, it has to be trusted to make sure the security around it so that you're confident it hasn't been hacked. And it needs to obviously empower the people using it. We have sort of three components to what we put out for our AI right now, and all of these are being developed. The interesting thing about this is, although this is literally going out to product, it's being developed in our research labs, which is a very odd situation, but AI is moving so quickly that it turns out that the researchers are the ones who know how to go build this stuff already. The development teams are literally catching up at the same time. So Watson X AI, which is a model factory, so you can play with different models. Data, which is a data factory for actually controlling your data. And then governance, to actually govern how you're training and knowing what that sort of provenance is of the models and data you've been using. So as a user, you can do all the steps you need to do for doing anything with a foundation model. You can train it, you can tune it, govern it, prompt it if you want to do prompt tuning. You start off by building up your data sets you want to use. There's the model factory you can pull from different types of models, both our own models as well as other people's models, and then governance so that you know how you actually built that model. And this is all then built on a platform where you've got data access through Red Hat to wherever your data sits. So you can have a public cloud, you can have your own private data. We are building data sets ourselves. We have something we call the blue pile. IBM is Big Blue, but anyway, it's a pile of data that we're training on, but where we've gone out and we are telling you what the data is coming from, and we're sure it's got the right licenses for use, and that we're allowed to use it for what we're trying to do. And we can run it through various levels of HAP filtering, so hate, abuse, and profanity filtering, to get rid of that if you want that out of your system. And we can also make sure that if you want stuff in only certain areas, or you want to avoid certain sources, we can tell you where that came from and make sure you're only using what it was. And then when we train a model, we'll tell you what we trained it on, so that if you want to use that pre-trained model, you know exactly where that training came from, so you don't have to worry about, did this get trained on something I'm going to regret later? So again, this is something that's really important to industry folks and enterprise folks who are going to use it, which sometimes gets lost in some of the consumer products that are out there. We have built up a set of libraries ourselves of models and continue to build those up over time. These models are huge, so it takes a long time to build them up, but we are building up a larger and larger portfolio of them. And we also partner with Hugging Face. Hugging Face is the biggest open source model creator out there. So if you want to use Hugging Face models, you can pull those in and use them as well, just mix and match depending on what you want to do. And I think it's really interesting because things are happening so fast in this space right now that literally, every time we think we're about to build a model, the first thing we do is go check out Hugging Face, because someone else might have already built it, in which case, great, we'll use theirs, and we can just train on the data we care about as well. So it's interesting even for a big company how much we are now dependent on open source as we do our work. And then we are seeing now companies actually start to pick this up, beyond just the big AI players. NASA, we actually just released, in the public space, a big foundation model based on a bunch of data that came from a bunch of satellites from NASA to basically do looking around the Earth, sustainability and climate kind of research. But release that out because there are a lot of people who are doing research in that area who'd like to play with that kind of stuff. So that's the neuron side. So last part would be qubits. And this is where we now are going to play with physics to deal with information in an entirely different way. So obviously qubits is all about quantum computing. And we like to say the new paradigm is on schedule. Doesn't mean it's here yet, but it's on schedule. Because there's a lot of hype, obviously, about AI and quantum, et cetera. We've been trying very hard, at least in the quantum space, to be realistic about the progress we're making, which honestly is faster, I think, than many of us thought it was going to be, but also be realistic about what the progress we're making, which means you aren't going to use your quantum computer tomorrow to solve the world's problems. Just briefly, quantum computers, the biggest difference is a normal computer uses a bit. It can be a 1 or a 0. Obviously, that's what we all are familiar with. A qubit is a quantum bit. It can also be a 1 or a 0, but you represent that by a quantum state. So a quantum state, of course, can be in a probability superposition of those two. So it has a probability of being a 1 or a probability of being a 0 at the same time. So therefore, when you're manipulating it, you're in a sense manipulating a very higher level state than one state. It's not just one potential unit. It's actually a couple of different units. Two things are important about that. One is the superposition, that you can actually be in this probability of 1s and 0s, a 1 and a 0 in a qubit. But more importantly even than that is that you can entangle two qubits. So if you have two quantum states, you can entangle them, which means that if you know the state of one, you instantly know the state of the other. And in fact, in a very real sense that bothered lots of people, including Einstein, when you measure one, you've literally determined what the other state's going to be, no matter where the other state sits. Once it's entangled, it could be the other side of the universe, it instantly is in the right state when you measure it. So it's a very weird function that obviously a lot of still philosophical discussion is what it means. It does appear to be true. And that entanglement is really important, because if you think about it, if you can entangle a whole bunch of these qubits at once, as you're manipulating one, you are in a sense manipulating a whole bunch of things at once. So that's a massive parallelism. Any physicists in the audience, that's exactly not how it works at all, but it's actually a good way to think about it just intuitively in terms of why quantum systems allow you to manipulate seemingly more than one thing at one time. So why does that matter? It's because on the bit side, on the Moore's law side, when we increase the number of transistors or number of bits we can represent on a chip, the power of that chip went up by roughly a factor of n. You increase it by n bits, you get roughly about more performance, roughly. In a qubit, it goes up by 2 to the n. So the number of states you can represent and effectively manipulate is actually an exponential now in n. So if I have 5 qubits, that's 32 states in a sense I can play with. If I have 10 qubits, I now have 1,024 states. So I went from double the number of qubits, I went from 32 to 1,024. Clearly a much steeper curve in terms of how powerful that system is. Now that assumes these are perfect qubits and they have great coherence and they're perfectly entangleable, none of which is true today yet, but that is exactly what the promise is over time. So what would that mean in terms of actual something real? So one of the biggest things that quantum systems can be used for is simulating things that are quantum, that are nature itself. So here's an example. Caffeine, a favorite molecule of many of ours, particularly professors and college students. It's a fairly simple molecule as molecules go. It's about 95 electrons, so not a huge molecule. If you wanted, though, to actually simulate the ground state of that molecule, exactly, using like a big supercomputer, you'd have to represent 10 to the 48 classical computer bits. You'd have to be manipulating that many. That's what that looks like written out. It's a lot of zeros. So that system is not a system you're ever going to build. You're never going to build a supercomputer that's big enough to go do that. And I say that fairly confidently because there's about 10 to the 50 atoms in the planet Earth. So that would be like using 10% of the atoms, 1% of the atoms to go build this. Probably not going to happen. So there are problems you just cannot solve with a classical system. If you wanted to solve this with qubits, it would, in theory, only take 160 qubits to do it. If you had perfect qubits, great coherence, perfectly able to entangle them together, you could go and simulate it with that number of qubits. Because 2 to the 160 is a pretty big number, on the order of 10 to the 48. So that's why it really does allow you to start to solve problems that you couldn't solve any other way. And that's why people get excited about this possibility. So to be clear, though, it doesn't. You could build a Turing-complete quantum computing system. You should not do that. You shouldn't bother with it. It would be really, really inefficient at most things it was going to do. But because there are a lot of problems we would call easy problems, so polynomial problems, P, that classical systems can usually handle. You have to build bigger and bigger ones, but you can usually get to them. There are hard problems, NP hard problems, that are really beyond anything the classical can do. So that's like the problem I just was talking about with the caffeine molecule. A subset of those problems can be solved by quantum systems much more efficiently. Not all of them. That's one thing to be clear. It doesn't solve like every NP hard problem out there at all. It does solve some of them, and some of them are very important. Though, so some of them that they can solve are very important problems to people. So that's why people get excited about using it. And it opens up a whole new space of places that we would never be able to reach on our own. One of those is factoring, and that's probably the one that gets the most talk, because that's what allows you to break the internet, as they would say. So basically, factoring is what the key is to our modern encryption technologies, most of which rely on really, really large prime numbers that no one can find, and therefore you can do math on them in ways that it's incredibly hard to break with a classical system. It is true that a quantum system that was large enough that is the kind of problem it could break in a reasonable amount of time when it gets large enough. So the good news is that, you probably have to have a system that's in the millions of qubits, just given what we think we know about error correction right now and how many qubits it's going to take to do the error correction we need. So we've got some time. But it's not that much time. So the latest study that came out from NIST said that they think there's a 50% chance that by 2030, we'll have a quantum system large enough that it could actually endanger the current encryption we use today. So that's not that far off, right? That's 5 years off. So the message is we should start making the world quantum safe now, right? So you don't have to worry about using your credit card tomorrow on the internet, but at some point we need to think about this. The good news on this, though, is that we already know how to solve this problem. This is not a problem that's unsolvable. So as I mentioned, there's only a subset of problems that quantum can do. There are sets of problems that can be used for encryption and cryptography that are not in that part that quantum can do. They do not map onto quantum computing. The biggest class of those is something called lattice cryptography. It's based on a set of math that's also used in multidimensional spaces with high lattices. So it turns out that is something you can't really break with a quantum computer any better than a classical system. And it has become computationally efficient enough now that people can start using it. So NIST ran this whole thing, and we were a part of this process of coming up with different algorithms one could use. Last summer, they announced the 4 winning algorithms that they were going to go now actually try and standardize. 3 of them came from IBM. We were very, very proud of that. We're continuing to work with them to actually standardize them now. We're expecting the first of those to get released for public comment sometime in the next month or 2, and then they should become standardized. So what that means is there will be a way that we can now go do encryption and cryptography that even when you build a big quantum system, it will still be safe. Now, the most important place to apply that now is on data that you're storing, right? So archival data. So governments and banks and places, healthcare systems, they care about keeping data private, not just for the next year, but like for the next 10 years or 20 years, right? So they're the people who are most concerned about it. Those are the people that we work with now already to encrypt their archives, right? To say, now's the time to go back and encrypt these archives and get them quantum safe, because you don't want to wait 10 years and have to go encrypt your entire tape library at that point. It would be remarkably inefficient. And moreover, we know there are already actors out there who are stealing stuff that's encrypted today with the idea that they'll be able to encrypt it in 5 or 6 years, right? So, people do think there's some players who have very long timelines that they're thinking about. So we got to think about that too. So actually the Z16, that mainframe I showed you, that was the world's first quantum safe platform. It's got a hardware chip in it that does cryptography that is in fact quantum safe. It's actually inside there's hardware too, so that no one's touching the keys. Literally the data in those mainframe systems is encrypted every second of its journey from the disk into the system, unencrypted just long enough to go through the processor, to get the processing done, immediately re-encrypted and comes back out. So it never is not encrypted, which is really important for banking transactions and things. And someday we'd like to have fully homomorphic encryption, so we would never have to unencrypt it, but that's still a ways out. But that system's already up and running, and we already are working with clients on how you encrypt things. The biggest change is going to be for the internet, because we do have to actually now implement this in everybody's credit card systems, et cetera. But I would expect we would see that happening in the next 3 to 4 years as soon as the standards come out. So it'll be interesting to see how that transition goes. All right, so what are the fun things you can do with quantum, the good things, not just breaking the internet? Simulating quantum systems. There's artificial intelligence, actually, that there are certain forms of artificial intelligence algorithms that are really hard to do, even with giant foundation model kind of things, that could, in fact, be amenable to a quantum algorithm instead. Optimization and Monte Carlo simulations, things like this. A lot of these are things that then you can read through the list there that businesses are interested in, as well as obviously researchers, because there are a lot of things that could be really improved in terms of finance in particular. So this is the IBM Quantum System 1 that we showed off a few years ago. This is now inside it. It obviously doesn't look like any computer you've probably seen before. In fact, actually, if I can get it to pause for a second, I don't know if I can pause or not. Let's see. So That's the chip. That's actually that's the quantum computer, really. It's sitting there. Everything else around it is the wires to bring in the signals, and it's all going to be in a cryogenic dewar. So that chip itself will be held at about 15 millikelvin. So that's 15 thousandths of a degree above absolute zero. That's about 200 times colder than space. Space is about 2 Kelvin or so. So it's cold. It's a cold place. But everything around it has to, of course, be incredibly low energy, low noise, because anything and all that goes on there will actually heat the chip up. So that's everything you see around is basically support for it. We use superconducting qubits as our platform. So these are basically Josephson junctions, nonlinear harmonic oscillators that have a couple states. There are other things out there. There's ions. There's silicon qubits as well. We think this is the most scalable of the platforms. I'll talk about our plans for scaling it. It's got advantages and disadvantages, but that's how we've decided to build it. We actually put the first system out in May of 2016 on the cloud. You can still go to it today. It's free. It had 5 qubits at the time. I think now our smallest system out there is, I think we're going to have nothing less than 100 qubits out by the end of the year. I think we still have a few that are 20 qubits out there. But it was amazing. We had no idea how many people were going to use this, but it turns out like we had hundreds of thousands of people use this thing really, really quickly. And lots of good tutorials out there on how to do it. When you use it, you basically put together the algorithm on a normal laptop. It gets sent out to actually manipulate the qubits. The qubit information is all then converted into 5 gigahertz microwave frequency, because basically what you're doing is tuning oscillators to be in superpositions of ones and zeros on the chip and entangling them and then manipulating them in various gates, just like you'd have an AND and an OR and a NOR gate. In normal logic, you've got different types of gates, the Z gate, the H gate, that actually manipulate qubits, and then comes back as a classical answer. Because quantum systems, once you measure them, you always get a 1 or a 0. You don't get something in between. But until you measure it, it has to stay in that state. That's the reason we keep it so cold, by the way. I mean, it's not so much, it is superconducting, but we probably have to only be around 4 Kelvin for that. It's to get rid of all thermal noise, because anything at all that you do to a qubit, including a single phonon hitting it, will knock it out of its superposition state, will knock it out of its entanglement, and then you got to start over. So there's a lot of errors that come into these systems right now. This is just a fun graph showing all the people using the system on the cloud since we put it out there. Can you see this? Should be, no, there's only one line on this one right now. You can see the numbers that went up. It's really all over the world. We even had we're getting a bunch of hits from an IP address that appeared to be in Antarctica, and we thought that was probably a mistake. Turned out, no, there was a scientist down there, a woman who got really bored in the winter in Antarctica because you don't get any things out, and taught herself quantum computing, and she was using our system. It was kind of cool. So we can say we are on all 7 continents. That's why it was really important. Anyway, we also have a big software infrastructure being built up around it, because obviously it's very different programming. Right now, it's very hard to program a quantum system unless you actually understand something about quantum. We're trying to get rid of that. We want to have layers of abstraction so that people who know chemistry algorithms can go run a chemistry algorithm on a quantum system without being a quantum physicist. So this is all open source, contributions from around the world. Obviously, IBM is one of the biggest contributors. We do lots of classes as well. We are really big on trying to educate the next quantum workforce, because I think that we all know that if this does take off, it's going to take a lot of people who understand it. On the software level in particular, you don't have to have that many people understand how to build it, but you have to have a lot of people who know how to use it. So we're spending a lot of time and money on that right now, and then making sure that we're trying to be really much more equitable in this. I have a group under me that does responsible and inclusive technology, and their goal is to really think about the ethics of a lot of stuff we build. So AI is, of course, one that has got all sorts of fraught issues right now, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. So with quantum, we decided about 2 years ago, hey, maybe we could do it right this time and not screw it up. We could actually start by being equitable and inclusive, and then maybe we wouldn't have so many troubles later on down the road. So we've done a lot of stuff like setting up quantum centers in the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities here in the US, a lot of work with community colleges and other places, trying to even make inroads into like the South, like into Brazil and into Africa, places that the digital divide almost never get technology as fast as the rest of the world. So we're trying our best to be as inclusive and broad as possible on it. So we'll see how this develops vis-a-vis what happened with AI. Lots of research papers coming out on this, obviously. A lot of people playing around with this, and a lot of work on when will we get to the stage that it actually can do something a classical system can't do. Because today, these systems, although they have a lot of qubits, as I'll show you, they are noisy. You can't entangle all of them at once. There's a lot of limitations to how deep a circuit you can run on it. So the reality is, for the vast majority of things, actually I would say, you can say 99.99% of the things, you can still do it better on a classical system than you could do on a current quantum system. But there is hope, and this actually a paper we did with Berkeley that just came out in Nature about a month or two ago, and it was basically simulating an Ising problem, an Ising model, which is something that can be used for simulating lots of things in nature, lots of chemical structures and things. And we were doing it on our quantum system. The group here was also working on one of the large supercomputing systems up in LVLL. And we were doing it in parallel to make sure the quantum system was getting the right answer, because obviously you have to be able to check it, and the classical system was doing it, and we got to a large enough model to where the classical system could not go any further, and the quantum system was able to continue to go on. For everything we understand, it was getting the right answer still. Obviously, whether it's exactly the right answer, how do you test something? It can only be tested by itself. It's hard to say, but at the same time, it appears to be that it was there. And the reason this was important was these are very noisy systems, right? So these are not systems that what we need. This system can nowhere be near doing factoring. It would be useless. But finding problems where we can start to apply noisy systems earlier will make a difference in terms of when this actually becomes useful. So people used to talk about quantum supremacy or quantum advantage. We try and talk about quantum utility now, which basically means when is it useful to somebody? Because it do something that's actually useful. So we look at this as like, here's a first baby step towards here. This is a little useful because it can do something a little more than the classical system could do. Long way to go, but I think we're entering that stage where we can start to call it useful. So a lot of companies working on this with us in our quantum network now, because I think a lot of people realize that when it does become useful, it could make really big differences in their business, depending on what they're doing. And they also realize that doesn't just mean waiting till it's there and then running an off-the-shelf program. You want to have your own people trained and knowing how to use the system so you can actually take advantage of it from an early stage, right? So that's the reason they're willing to put money in and do stuff now when it's clearly not useful to them yet, but it will be. And we do have a roadmap. We have a very clear roadmap on the number of qubits we expect to see. So by the end of this year, we should have 1,000 qubits on a chip. We did make our 400 qubit chip last year. But you can see going forward, it's not just on a single chip. It's going to be too many for a chip eventually. So we have to start to interconnect between chips, both in a quantum and a classical sense. At the same time, we got to be developing all of the software kernels, all the software algorithms, and eventually quantum services, we would call it, basically the ability to actually help people utilize it for something. So we're trying to build all layers of the stack at once. And we have this roadmap that we set out, and we continue to add a year to it every year to make sure we're making progress on it. The things we have to do from a hardware perspective: scale, just obviously bigger and bigger, more and more qubits, more and more of them interconnected. That's important. Equally important, though, is quality. So the error rate's got to continue to come down. Our ability to entangle deeper circuits has to come down. We measure it by something called quantum volume, which is basically effective depth of how much you can utilize of a circuit, which is not necessarily the number of qubits, but it's the number of useful qubits you can get out of it in the end. And speed, which is something that hadn't been talked about much in the past, but if you're going to do these calculations, how fast you can change states or manipulate states matters. That's one of the biggest reasons we chose the superconducting one. One was it's a nice planar structure we know how to make. But two, if you look at like ion spins, which by the way have really high quantum volumes, they're really good for error rates. They're very slow, like 1,000 times slower to do a spin flip on that compared to this. We think it's going to be a real problem because you can start to figure out how many calculations you have to do, how long it's going to take you. That's a problem in scalability. So these are very fast. We want to continue to increase the speed of this over time. So what does this look like? So this year, we're going to actually start our first classical parallelization of qubits. So we're going to take individual chips and actually start to connect them together. So you look at a qubit chip now. You've got the resonators on top. You've got a resonator layer, which is basically where all of they communicate in sort of a quantum sense, let's say. I mean, basically, it's the frequencies that are communicating, and the I/O layer in the bottom, which is where we send the signals in. So for this first round, we want to connect the I/O layers between them, so it'll be classical connections between them. We will not be able to entangle qubits from one chip to another, but it will allow us to have a larger system in terms of the number of physical qubits you have access to at that time. Obviously, that's helpful, but the next thing we need to do is go to quantum communication. So in that case, we want to take a chip, and instead, we want to actually basically connect the resonator levels themselves on a multi-chip module, so you can actually then entangle qubits between chips, so then you really can take access to a very much larger quantum circuit. We hope to have that done by the end of next year with 408 qubits. Obviously, once you do that, you could also think about connecting between two chips in a quantum sense. So in that case, again, you want to connect to that resonator level, but now you're going to go on a cable afterwards. Most likely, that's going to be optical communication. Optics is very good for transferring quantum states. The challenge is that transduction, because you got to go from the microwave frequency you're at to some sort of optical frequency, and then back down to the microwave frequency. And do that without losing track of the quantum information. So not trivial, but there's actually a lot of really good work going on within IBM, but also within universities on this. This is an ongoing engineering and science problem, I would say, in this case, to make this work. But then we hope to get up to a larger number of qubits that way, and eventually we're going to want to get to very large multi-chip processors. So we envision putting together many of these in multiple doers, in multiple stations around a data center, and eventually we really do envision having kind of a quantum supercomputer over time. So 4,000 qubits, 8,000, 16,000, 20,000. These are the goals as we move forward on this over the next several years. And eventually, these should all be mostly optically connected, but eventually have data centers that look very much like modern data centers along the way. Just put a stake in the ground for overall scale. We announced just earlier this summer a partnership with the University of Tokyo and the University of Chicago to build a 100,000 qubit quantum system by 2033. So it's a pretty ambitious goal to actually get to that level, but I don't think it's infeasible. I think it'll be challenging for us, but I don't think it's infeasible to get there. I think the biggest questions marks there are, can we continue to get the error rates down? Can we continue to make progress on error correction codes? Because you'll never get errors to zero. And quantum systems are probabilistic by nature, so you will have to have error correcting codes that actually run on top of them, and there's active research on that. And the biggest question there is, if I need 10 qubits to create one error-free qubit, that's very feasible. If I need 1,000 qubits to do one error-free qubit, a little more challenging. You get to millions, then you got a real problem. So that is, I'd say, the one thing that could potentially be a showstopper for really building a truly universal gate-based quantum system, is if you really can't get that error correction thing figured out. I think most people are comfortable that we have multiple paths that could get us there, but until we actually see that, it's an open question. All right, so I think that's the end of what I was going to talk about today. Hopefully, showed you how we think about this all coming together in one unit. And if you have interest in how we're doing this with the multi-cloud, we actually have multiple systems coming together. We expect to see this will produce one large cloud system where people will literally be able to use these things as though they were one thing. That's our ultimate goal, right? To make it so you can actually use this as though it were one system, not semi-quantum thing, semi-AI thing, semi-HPC thing. You should use this like you use any other resource. So that's actually a very big challenge. The Sky Lab here is who we're doing a lot of that with right now. We're just trying to do it with classical systems, forget these fancy quantum systems. But if we can get to a point where we really can use cloud systems in a much more user-friendly way where people can move things around and not have to worry about the distributed system nature of it, it can make a big difference in just even in classical computing as well. So if you're interested in anything more, on the research website, we have our roadmap for all of our various technologies and how they connect together. You go interact with it and get some feeling of what we're actually doing and what we plan to do over the next several years, as well as, of course, all the publications and things that we come out with as well. So that's it. Thanks very much, and happy to answer a couple questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff. That was an awful lot of great information. Do we have any questions?
Jeff, great talk. I have a question about all the different applications you are showing for quantum computing. So if I look at the list that you are showing, many of them are not really quantum problems.
Yeah.
So is there a reason to expect quantum speed up, or what kind of advantage does a quantum computer bring?
Right, so all those we have listed up there are ones, so first of all, to Saif's point, there's only two things we actually know are actually better on quantum systems: Shor's algorithm and Grover's algorithm. Those are the two that have been proven that quantum systems can do it in a way classical systems can never do it. One of those, Shor's has to do with factoring, and Grover's has to do with search algorithms. Everything else is speculation, right, that quantum can do it better. So the ones we list there are ones where we believe there's credible work going on quantum algorithms that could do that faster than a classical system. I would say definitely we don't know that they all will. In fact, we're finding more and more, as we advance something in quantum and come up with a quantum approach, some classical person says, that's interesting, and then takes that and does it in a classical way, and it turns out you didn't actually need the quantum part of it, you just need an interesting new way to look at the algorithm. So yeah, I think of those, which ones actually turn out to be, yes, this is going to be what you want to use, we don't know.
Okay.
Other questions? Everyone is completely overwhelmed. Way in the back.
Yeah, so
Hold on, we need a microphone for recording.
So what are current job prospects for the quantum space offered at IBM?
Oh yeah, so we're hiring across the board in the quantum space. It's one of the areas we're growing. So everything from, hardware engineers, obviously people who understand quantum is good, but there's a lot of classical electronics and classical stuff that goes into that system that we need to make advancements on. In the technology. A lot of work in software right now. A lot of work in advanced algorithms. Like to Saif's question, we have groups that are looking at what are real applications in chemistry that we can really build something that's better, or applications in optimization. So really across the board. In fact, actually, we're right now in the middle of our internship recruiting process. So go on to the IBM.com/jobs website. Take a look. There's internships in all areas, including quantum, which we do hire a lot of interns in every summer.
Do you mainly hire graduate students for the jobs?
Mostly grad students, although we do occasionally, we'll take somebody like their junior or senior year, particularly an outgoing senior, for example, in a bachelor's who's going on to a master's degree. Oftentimes we'll pick up somebody there. Quantum, I don't know actually what their profile is, but they're probably the same as the rest of us, which means the majority are grad students, but they're probably some undergrads. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fancy throne microphone. Jeff, I was an intern at TJ Watson eons ago as an undergrad, and I really appreciated the sort of cross-disciplinary opportunity that you got just walking around the building and meeting different groups. Your slide about can we do this right for quantum compared to the current state for AI gave me a little bit of a pause. Of course, hindsight's 2020, but right now, 2023, fast-moving landscape, is there anything you think we can use as levers to sort of course correct on the AI?
Oh yeah, so we're working very hard on the AI side as well, actually, as the whole industry, to be fair. I think everyone's realized, that we took some wrong steps here. A couple things. We certainly have got a lot of work going on right now where, similar to what we're doing in quantum, where the stuff we're doing with large language models and things, getting lots of groups involved, not just the white male infrastructure, which still is what's written mostly on the internet, for that matter. So making sure we're pulling in different groups to actually get language sources on, even in English, just making sure we're getting lots of different sources, making sure our teams are particularly teams that are building models right now, making sure there is some diversity on those teams. And diversity oftentimes we can do by moving to different labs. So we have AI work going in all of our global labs, which we also find is interesting because it gives you a geographic diversity, a difference of cultures and biases and things, which it really is a big issue for AI right now. And we think in Western culture, we think we know what the right answers are, but the reality is we don't actually know what the right answers are, and we know that it won't necessarily translate to other cultures. So yeah, we're trying to do a lot of that on the research level and on the product side too. Actually, we have this product AI 360 that people can use to monitor the outputs of their current AI systems, and it doesn't know what's ethical or not ethical, but it can flag things like, we notice that there's a correlation between this kind of person and this kind of output. Is that okay? And so, for example, like you're giving loans, and it said, we notice that you don't tend to give loans to people who make less than $5,000 a year. You'd say, okay, I think that's probably not a bad correlation. That's probably true. And that's probably something I intend. It says, we notice you don't give loans to people in this zip code. Well, there's a good red flag. Why don't I give loans in this zip code? Could this be that that zip code has a certain demographic? Am I inadvertently doing something that I shouldn't be doing in terms of some sort of racial discrimination, even though the AI itself doesn't understand race or understand those people in that zip code have it? So it can flag that stuff for the person who's using it, and at least then that person can decide, is that a problem or not, and then they can adjust as needed.
Hi, could you reveal why IBM is so much advanced in other competitors like Google, and in terms of quantum computing?
Yeah.
Because I have heard the news that IBM has 7 times more quantum bits than Google.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, it's the one place I feel like I can confidently say IBM is ahead, and it's hard to say in any industry or anything, and certainly there are places we have not been ahead in the past. So quantum, I think this is a direct result of the kind of research environment we've got. So we've been working on quantum qubits since the late 90s. I mean, when I first started at Almaden, there was Isaac Schwang was a researcher there before he went to MIT, and he built a 7-qubit ion-based system, and it was a toy, right? We had no idea what to do with it. We had no clue as to where it was going to go, but we built it and we continue to work on it. In fact, the very first ever meeting where the idea of quantum computing came out was in May of 1981. It was joined between MIT and IBM. It brought a bunch of physicists in. Charlie Bennett was a physicist who's still with us at IBM, one of the fathers of quantum computing, and Richard Feynman was there. And that's where Richard Feynman made his famous statement that nature is quantum, damn it, and if you want to simulate it, you need a quantum system. And so we started talking about it. And from there, we just did research on it. And it was about 10 years ago when suddenly we're like, hey, you know what? this research we're doing, technology is getting close enough. We think we can actually build something. And so we started building it. And then as soon as we saw that first system we put out on the cloud in 2016, I mean, one advantage of working for a big company is you do have deep pockets. That if you choose to, you can say, you know what, we're going to go all in on this. So then they put a ton of money in right away. So that's it, we're going to go. We're going to take a bet on this. We don't know if it's going to work, but we think it's worth it, and we think there's a chance this could make a big difference in the future. So there's a lot of disadvantages for working for a big company, don't get me wrong, but there are some advantages. And occasionally when they decide to get behind something like that, you can really make a big change. But it was because they also were willing to invest in it for 30 years before that at very small levels in research, and just keep it going to see what happens.
Any other questions? Well, okay, I think maybe we'll stop.
Thank you.
And thanks very much to Jeff for this great overview.